A lot of my old friends think of me as a jazz guitar player because I was a jazz guitar professor in my 20s. But friends that I've known for the past 25 years think of me as a kind of a metal producer because I produced metal bands for years. And if you look behind me, you see a lot of high gain 100-watt amps. I also use amp simulators like the Helix, the XFX3, and amp sim plugins like the Neural DSP Pliny and Abasi amps. And of course, Abasi 7-string guitars. So to discuss this idea, whether progressive metalheads are more open-minded to other genres of music, I decided to call up my good friend Tosin Abasi and talk about it. Okay, so I'm recording now. Hold on. I'm recording. I have my phone right here, too, that I'm recording on.
Okay, so you probably got it, right?
I got it. You look great, man.
So do you.
All right, so
I didn't do any research, Rick.
you don't need to do any research. We're just gonna improv here.
All right.
We're gonna jam. Tosin, you and I talk all the time. We talk about a lot of different things, but one of the topics recently that I was discussing with you is whether you think that people that play metal, or let's say progressive metal, are more open-minded than your average musician.
I mean, my intuitive response is yes.
That's kind of a leading question, because you know that that's actually my premise, is that I think that people that are into the progressive metal movement are much more open-minded about other genres of music.
Yeah, look, I think open-minded, it's double-edged, because there's kind of a persona that can come with being a metalhead that is like, you definitely don't crank Adele as you're like rolling down the street, because it's almost contrary to like the persona. But I think progressive metal is musically challenging. It's diverse in its range of expression. Dynamically, it asks a lot of the listener. And so intuitively, it makes me think that if someone's a fan of that, they have, like, I think, a bigger appreciation for music in general.
Let's talk about the harmonic element first. The type of chord progressions used, the kind of lines that are used linearly, before we even talk about the rhythmic part or the sounds. To me, progressive metal is the closest thing harmonically to jazz. I mean, a lot of the harmonies that you use not only are jazz inspired, but you use things that you would find more in modern classical music. You don't hear that in other types of rock, and frankly, in other types of metal. When I listen to Dream Theater, for example, I don't hear those particular types of chord changes. I hear a certain harmonic vocabulary that is, to me, more along the lines of traditional metal.
With some modal stuff sprinkled.
With some modal stuff in there. But what you do, you use things like the augmented scale, or you will use different devices that you wouldn't normally find. Honestly, a lot of these things you don't even find in jazz. It's more in modern classical music. But a much more sophisticated harmonic palette.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think jazz gets a license to explore Western harmony to its fullest extent, but it's a defined genre, and a lot of people participating in jazz want to play by the established rules. Then classical music, in a lot of ways, has its own limitations to the harmony that's acceptable. But within both those genres, I feel like progressive metal is just free to poach all the harmonic content from both of those genres, and there's no limitations on what you get to do in progressive metal. So yeah, I think that's in the harmonic category, we're validating that it's
Okay, so here's the question. How do you make that harmonic vocabulary work with distortion, for example? I know with you, a lot of your more intricate things you don't necessarily play. There will be things that are broken up into single notes that create the harmonic structure, as opposed to playing static chords that are really dissonant, although you do that as well.
Yeah, you kind of nailed it. I think because progressive metal oftentimes is guitar centered, you can arpeggiate voicings with distortion, and it gives the contour of a complex chord that would be hard to merely just strum that chord with a bunch of distortion. So all these lead guitar players get to sweep these arpeggios, and you choose the right guitarist, you're going to hear some interesting harmony outlined, but it's not played as a chord. And then the other device that progressive metal gets away with using complex harmony is by layering clean guitar, almost like you would a pad. So layering that on top of a distorted rhythmic part, and you get to introduce harmonic content without that fight of trying to play that on a distorted, instrument.
Okay, so why are you in particular interested in stretching out beyond traditional harmony and playing some of these using some of the more, not esoteric scales, but unused scales and unused harmony than you would typically find in metal?
For me, it's like personal taste. I think I hear certain players and a light bulb goes off in my brain. Hearing Alan Holdsworth's approach to harmony and lead guitar playing. It's an impact. It's like, you're like, whoa, what is this territory? Because I feel like for the listener, harmony, it highlights certain types of emotions. So it renders in the listener, if it's a minor scale, it's melancholy or sad, or if it's, you get the idea. And I think jazz started this attempt to push that basic sort of palette of emotionality further. But then you get into, guys like Holdsworth and various other, progressive or fusion players, and you're starting to get flavors that are very hard to pinpoint. So for me as a metal musician, I knew that the heavy dynamic was impactful. I knew that the rhythmic expression is very impactful, but I wasn't satisfied with like the basic harmony I was hearing, because I knew how impactful harmony could be. So for me, progressive is like almost like going into space, like expanding comfortability beyond even like our planet. You know what I mean? And so these symmetrical scales and these certain tonalities that I think you're hearing oftentimes in fusion, putting them in metal, you can layer on this really progressive sound. It sounds beyond familiarity.
I want to dig into this Holdsworth thing a little bit more. Holdsworth was actually harmonically outside the mainstream compared to most fusion players. If I think of somebody like the Chick Corea Electric Band, or I'm trying to think of other people that you would consider fusion, that they're not using the kind of harmonies. I mean, if I think of Frank Gambale playing with Chick, they're still using a lot of traditional jazz harmonies, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas Holdsworth they're not using the augmented scale or the harmonic major scale, things like that Holdsworth would use. I mean, Holdsworth was really out on his own with this.
I've thought about this. There's prog metal and prog rock, which is actually not as progressive as the title would lead you to believe. It's almost like a snapshot of the progenitors of progressive rock, so you have your Yes and your Genesis, and it's almost like, as a producer, you're going to hear certain synth generations, you're going to hear certain types of tones in the palette that represent the genesis of prog. And I think people carry that tradition, and that's when you say prog, you kind of refer to that. Then there's progressive, as a fundamental approach, which doesn't have those parameters. It's whatever you want it to be. So I feel like it's easier to talk about that type of progressive because there's no ceiling on it. And then when it comes to Holdsworth, I feel that he impacted metal players and jazz fusion players. But I don't think there's a lot of rock dudes and a lot of, so
Well,
I
Eddie
think,
Van Halen he influenced.
yeah. But, I feel like I think just Eddie was just like tuned into amazing stuff and wasn't trying to limit, what he thought was good or not. But no, yeah, I think for me, focusing on Holdsworth might be an example of like how little I may have searched for other dudes who have impacted. I don't know, but to me, he stands on top as far as like pushing guitar harmony forward in a context that wasn't straight ahead jazz.
Now, you and I have talked about Per Nilsson, for example. If you look at his YouTube channel, some of the tunes that he's played over, he'll play over, I believe, Non-Brewed Condiment, which is a Holdsworth tune that he solos over. And there's a Pat Metheny song, Song for Bilbao. He solos over these traditionally fusion chord progressions, but he's a metal guitar player, yet he has the feel and the harmonic language in his soloing of a fusion player.
I'm thinking about it. I feel like something happens with a very capable guitar player who starts with technique and is very, very adept. And then he's like, all right, what do I plug into this technique? And you start to end up getting these metal guys who are first concerned with like maybe shredding, and then they ending up in a harmonic space that is as complex as the techniques they're using. And then we go back to the fact that you kind of have to source that from jazz or classical music because it's not happening in reggae.
Let's talk about your rhythmic concept and how you view rhythm in progressive metal or in your own writing and where that comes from.
So I feel like metal and rhythm have always been bedfellows because you can use the guitar as a percussive element and it's heavy. You using syncopation, making the whole band become like syncopation is kind of a really effective way to communicate heaviness. But the earlier days of metal, those rhythms were a lot simpler. And I think it's just like a natural evolution to like yearn for more complexity because there's a frenetic effect of doing very complex rhythms. It has an emotional impact. It's chaotic. It can be overwhelming, So I think metal is kind of concerned with impacting people, and rhythm is one way to do it. For me, it was bands like the Dillinger Escape Plan, Candiria, Between the Buried and Me, and Meshuggah is like the one metal band that I think created a whole new path forward as far as how to utilize syncopation. As like a primary force of like a song. So I don't feel like I really created much. I feel like I'm pulling from bands like Meshuggah and Dillinger and stuff like that. And it creates an appetite for the same type of complex rhythms. So you can find it in Indian classical music, or you can find it in Malian music is odd metered, prog rock. And there's some cool like post-bop stuff that really gets into, intense compositions. So that's kind of where I started mutating the rhythmic part. It was kind of the Meshuggah thing, really.
To me, that's what I find so compelling about prog metal is that there's this bringing together of all these different elements. There's a rhythmic intensity, there's a sonic intensity, there's the bringing in things, the synthesizers. Things that traditionally you wouldn't find in metal bands of the 90s, for example, that would be more riff-based and wouldn't have the sophisticated, drum grooves. If you think of bands like Metallica or something. For the most part, Lars was a very simplistic drummer. they generate their power from a lot of unison playing between the bass and the guitars with a straight drum playing. If you think of, and I think this, some of it in the later albums, the Bob Rock era, if you think of, Sad But True, dun, 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 dun. Whereas now, in progressive metal, there's a lot of really intricate, especially in Animals, very intricate drumming that goes right along with the guitar riffs.
But its genesis is in metal, and I think it's good we're talking about drumming, because I feel progressive metal has some of the best drumming you're gonna hear. Like, the demand for the drummer to truly exploit rhythm is extremely high. So when you were doing Sad But True, like, I got this imagery of like a war march, right? And I think metal started with an emotive effect. It had kind of this like warlike emotive effect. And I think progressive metal is more like this like scientific approach to like stretching the idea of the emotions you're feeling, and instead of like compelling you to action with like a very conspicuous rhythm, oftentimes it is like activating very cerebral experiences in your brain as you try to decode a complex rhythm. And so I don't know if you know a lot of progressive metalheads. They're not like really tough dudes. They're kind of like they're nerds. Right. Myself included. I think that's very different than if you go to like a Five Finger Death Punch concert or something like that. So prog, it's kind of this open-minded, analytical, exploratory sort of subset of metal.
That's a great point there. That the kind of people that listen to progressive metal, my assistant Billy is like that. That's all of his friends are kind of the nerdy kind of guys that love really intricate music. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a nerdy guy, but I love intricate music, and I love music that is heavy. I always have. I produced. You know this. I've produced a lot of metal bands, and there's something about the power of heavy riffing, especially heavy low-tuned riffing.
I didn't start the trend of lower equals heavier, but I definitely ride the wave. I mean, I think after a certain point of standard tuned metal riffing, there's just began this sort of progression of like, maybe you go to drop D, and then maybe you do C sharp standard, and then you had guys like Steve Vai and John Bertucci playing 7 strings in the 90s, and you got your Korns and your Limp Bizkits and Sepultura and all these bands and Deftones. And I think from that point forward, the obvious consensus is that lower notes are heavier. And I don't know if you think about this, but if you listen to a lot of, take dubstep or a lot of like trap, it's all sub,
all low tones, all sub harmonics, very, very low tones.
The metalhead in me was kind of amused at the dubstep ascension, because there are people who I don't think knew they liked heavy music, like raging to dubstep, and I'm like, this is a breakdown. You could replace those bass lines with a distorted guitar, palm muting, and you're almost listening to metal, but it's synthetic sound sources.
Let's talk about your guitar recording setup for the new record.
We did a shootout. I have a specific sound, and so we did a shootout of gear to kind of get that sound, only to realize that the plugin that I designed outperforms all the other ways in which I would try to get that sound. So it's a combination of the Neural DSP plugin with Misha's company, the GGD's got these impulse responses, the Zilla pack. So I think we're using those impulses, speaker impulses, with the Abasi plugin.
Those are the ones Nolly did, right?
Yeah. So Nolly did the ones inside of the Abasi plugin, but he also, I'm pretty sure, worked on the GGD.
Yeah, I think he
IRs
did.
as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you have that stuff, but
Yeah, I do.
yeah,
I do. It's excellent.
it's excellent. And I'm really stoked that objectively it works the best in the mix on our newest album. I mean, that's for me the most legitimate, test of the gear. If it's like in a blind shootout, you know what you want, and it happens to be something that you designed for that purpose. So that's what we're using.
Those IRs, people I don't think realize. I think these are still hard for people to understand impulse responses, and to me this is really the future of guitar, I think, as far as being able to, even if you're using a real amplifier head and going through some type of a box and then using an IR inside the computer, IRs are really, really important. That's why it's when I see someone like Nolly that really knows guitar tones, bass tones, when he was starting to, I talked to him about this, when he was starting to make his IRs, I thought that was really great. They need to be made by people that know how speakers work. And I mean, he has a really in-depth knowledge of this stuff. He is incredibly analytical when it comes to, I don't know if you've seen him talk about any of this stuff, but it's really interesting.
Ollie's a scientist. It's cool, but he's also an insane guitar player.
He is.
It's rare that you get an engineer who also is an insane guitar player and knows what they want out of tone, not just from a listener perspective, but someone who could get on there and play. So I think the net result is some of the best IRs out there, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
So, they're killing it.
Yeah. Tosin, let's talk about things that people might not know about progressive metal. I have a pretty big audience on my channel. If somebody were to say, well, what should we check out first? Or what are some of the things we should check out beyond you? Because obviously, and people know you from my channel, but talk about it in general, kind of some of the, some of the important records to check out, or things stylistically that people might be interested in.
Yeah. I think metal gets a bad rap as being, or progressive metal. It's like, apparently you should be misanthropic and not a very happy person, and you're like, summoning the dark side. And I actually think that I've seen some studies that metal is really popular in places that have like high levels of well-being. so it's kind of counter to the from the outside looking in, it's counter to what you would think. So places like Canada and Scandinavia, and,
right.
And I think there's also a positive correlation to IQ. So, and I think this makes sense because progressive metal is oftentimes musically complex.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a lot of rhythmic complexity and a lot of harmonic complexity. And if you can get past the presentation, there's a lot of really stimulating musical content in there.
A lot of my jazz player friends like progressive metal. That just is, but I think it's not just for jazz players.
Progressive metal has something to offer in the emotional sphere. And I kind of feel like, with movies, there are like really sort of intense horror films. Have you ever asked yourself, like, why did someone make this? Like, why did someone conceive of these really dark scenes and like put energy into rendering them for other people to consume? And why do people consume it? And I think basically the spectrum of human emotion incorporates some dark, complex elements to it. And I think most popular music avoids a lot of that stuff unless it's like a breakup song. And I think if you only consume a lot of the pop stuff, it's almost like you've never really got into horror films or thrillers or, or action movies. So I think metal carries that torch of like, using music as a vehicle to express some of the darker elements of human psychology, but as an exercise, like not as like a thing you should go and do, or like not that you necessarily feel like that, but because everyone's had nightmares or complex dark thoughts at some point. And so I've always appreciated metal as like making that contribution to like what we can listen to, you know?
It's interesting. When I was a kid, there was a show called Dark Shadows. It was a horror soap opera. It was on from 66 to 71. And the main character's name was Barnabas Collins. He was a vampire, but this was a 5-day-a-week horror soap opera that was on at 4:00 in the afternoon. It had vampires, werewolves, witches, warlocks, all these things. And it had very modern, a lot of modern classical music, really dark, atonal music. I did a video where I talked about the music from this show, I don't know, last year or so. And it made me realize that I loved horror movies. And I think that I love modern classical music for the same reason that I always loved horror movies.
I think there's a thread of continuity for sure. And if we take something like horror or thrillers or psychological thrillers, you do have to set the mood for those scenarios. And the linearity of a lot of progressive compositions, it's like you don't know where the song is going sometimes. There is like a defiance of expectation. There are these jolting switches of how long a musical phrase is. I think music is always, as a listener, you have expectations of the song because intuitively we understand how scales work, whether we've studied them or not. And even phrases, even meters feel intuitively, more balanced than odd metered phrases. So it seems like progressive metal is very interested in going in the areas of like discomfort, but not merely for the sake of like visceral discomfort. There's a mental decode, like we're trying to decode where's the song going. Oh wait, this is atonal. Oh wait, this meter's shorter than I thought it would be. I think that has an effect that's akin to watching a kind of a movie that you don't know what's going to happen next, and it's yeah, I don't know. I think it's the musical equivalent in a lot of ways.
What? Just briefly talk about progressive metal bands that have vocals and how they differ from instrumental bands musically.
There are bands like Dream Theater who I'm going to use because I think there's obviously a lot of prog rock bands that are quintessential, but I feel like Dream Theater came along and they're more metal than rock,
Yes.
And from the caliber of lead playing to the actual tones to how heavy some of the parts are. So to me, they're a progressive metal band that kind of is like obviously foundational. The vocals are like operatic. They are virtuosic. It's like a very small subset of men can sing like that. The vocal range.
Yeah, it goes right along with the complexity of the music.
Yeah, so the vocalist has to understand the complexity of the song form, and so I think it's cool, but it might be a reason why a lot of progressive metal bands end up instrumental as well, because it's kind of hard to find that talent. Dream Theater is progressive metal; no one would challenge that, but I think there are bands that are considered extreme metal that I think are actually progressive bands, like the Dillinger Escape Plan just defined their own lane of metal. And it is extreme, but it's extremely musical complex. It's dynamic. So to me, they should be listed as a progressive metal band. And it's not for the faint of heart, but right. if you're up for it, any one of their albums will like blow your mind, And then you mentioned Meshuggah, who I don't think ever set out to be a progressive metal band.
No,
they're just Swedes who had their own vision of what metal should be. I know they were huge Metallica fans, and then I think they mutated into this original thing. And I know Frederick Thorndahl, the lead guitar player, is a huge Holdsworth fan. So you're hearing literal Holdsworth style chord pads and legato lines on top of this very complex, heavily syncopated music.
It's fascinating though that Holdsworth is this person that was a big influence, I would say, on progressive metal. yet he was from the progressive rock. He cut his teeth in progressive rock and was a jazz musician as well.
That's the thing. So I guess maybe just as a player, he wasn't as concerned with genre as he was with just musical vision. And he kind of touched down in certain genres for periods of time, but eventually just becomes Holdsworth. And I think that is truly progressive. So I guess it makes sense that he ends up being this dude we keep coming back to, also as guitar players. I feel like there aren't a ton of guitar players who you could look at their lead playing and know exactly who it is.
Yep.
And then you can listen to their sound and you know exactly who it is. And then you can also, here's the thing with a lot of like amazing lead players, it's not like you know what their clean tone sounds like.
Right. But you know exactly what Holdsworth's clean tone sounds like. And his clean tone and his harmonic, the progressions that he played are so him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, anybody that tries to do anything like that sounds like they are copying Holdsworth.
Yeah.
He staked that position out, that vocabulary, the tones that he used. His clean tone, I would say, is as famous as his lead tone.
I would agree.
So maybe Alan Holdsworth is kind of the godfather of progressive metal.
Progressive lead play. I don't know if he ever really just gave us a riff.
He did. He has no riffs like that. They weren't really metal riffs. It's so interesting.
I think if we're really trying to find the genesis of this stuff, we can't find a singular source because I think it's everything from Yes and Genesis to Dream Theater to Holdsworth to even Metallica.
Yeah.
Because I think the metal part we can't separate from the progressive metal part, and so it has some lineage from metal. I just think metal as a genre, past a certain point, doesn't limit you musically. You're allowed to have an 11-minute song that doesn't repeat, and you know what I mean. And
right back to my original point that progressive metal musicians are the most open-minded because they'll listen to an 11-minute song that has no repeated sections.
I think you're right, man. I'm hard pressed to find a better example of like musical width, you know what I mean? And it's easier to go down from something as intense as metal to appreciating other things versus being an opera fan and then working your way up to appreciating Metallica, or the case is. So I think musical tolerance for progressive metal heads is where it's kind of high. Just because. I don't know. I just think we're the smartest, most, open-minded.
There you go. Awesome, Tosin. You're the man. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, dude, that was fun. Good seeing you.
That's all for now. Don't forget to subscribe. If you're a first-time viewer, ring the bell. That'll let you know when I go live and when a new video comes out. Give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment. That's very important. If you're interested in the Beato book, go to my website at www.rickbeato.com. Follow me on Instagram at rickbeato1. Check out the new Beato ear training program at beatoeartraining.com. And if you want to support the channel even more, think about becoming a member of the Beato Club. Thanks for watching.